My name's Steve Weiler. I've worked for many years with community organisations and social enterprises across the country, but also doing a bit of research and a bit of writing, trying to discover what's happened in the past that maybe can give us some indications of how we could behave now and what the future might hold. We could see the best and the worst of human behaviour, and of how communities came together or didn't come together to respond. So in London, it was pretty dreadful. And quite famously, Samuel Pepys, in his diary, talked about how one day, I think it was the 4th of September in 1665, he went, ate some fruit from the king's garden, he went for a walk in a park, he visited a friend, but on the way back, he passed a farm where 21 people had died of the plague. And it got him thinking about what was really happening. And he said in his diary, he wrote that this plague has made us as cruel as dogs, one to another. It's a striking phrase, and you can see why he said it. There was huge cruelty. If there was plague in a house, suspected in a house, then there was a kind of forced lockdown, a quarantine system. A red cross was painted on the door. Guards were set outside the house to make sure nobody escaped, and those inside were left to their fates. And a whole new servants and apprentices were thrown out onto the streets early on, to get by as best they could, often with terrible consequences. And there was a whole new kind of class of professions: the watchers, who were the guards set outside the houses, and the searchers, who went into the houses to see if anyone was alive, and nurses, who gave some rudimentary medical aid and comfort to those who were dying, and the bearers, who took away the corpses to the pits outside the city, the common graveyards. And these were people who really had no choice. They were paid. They were the very poorest, the outcasts of society, who were forced to do these jobs just to earn enough to keep body and soul together, even though often at the cost of their own lives. And it was quite shocking. Some people who were very wealthy could escape the city and the worst effects, but most couldn't. And in fact, when they tried to, the surrounding towns and villages refused them entry, refused them to go any further, and they had to turn back. So, desperate situation. Everyone, it seemed, having to look out for themselves. And as it appears, the very poorest bearing the brunt. It does make me think, actually, of how much things have really changed now, when we know that the people who are at the forefront of the care system, in care homes, in hospitals, are primarily from poorer communities, from immigrant communities, from black ethnic minority communities, and haven't always had proper protection, and appear to be also most vulnerable and bearing the brunt. Different in scale, perhaps, but some similar themes emerging. And yet, also in 65, we saw another example that was so different. And that was in Eyam, in Derbyshire. And it's an example that's become, I think, justly celebrated. A community where, a small town, small village, where all the local people, partly impelled by religious belief and partly by, I think, a sense of social solidarity, decided to voluntarily self-quarantine to keep everyone within the village rather than let people travel abroad and spread it throughout the neighbouring villages and districts of Derbyshire. So in order to save many thousands of other people's lives, they created a kind of a community self-isolation at terrible cost to themselves. Many died, and yet over many months, more than a year, they kept going. The quarantine was not broken, and And it was an act of, I think, quite extraordinary community solidarity, and one that I think has become a bit of a beacon of what can happen when a community really, um, almost in a heroic way, pulls together um, for a bigger common good. And so there you are from that period, one of the kind of worst set of stories imaginable, and one of the most inspiring. I think it's hard, very hard, to know the full story, because often the real neighbourhood micro community activity is not recorded. But what is clear is that the government action was, by and large, certainly early on, not trusted by the general population, because the country was at war, as were so many other countries. It was the First World War was still in a critical phase. There were all sorts of reasons for governments to suppress the information. It was called the Spanish flu because in other countries people pretended it wasn't going on at first. There was a lack of information about what was happening. The formal responses were, it seems from in hindsight at least, extraordinarily weak. Many things continued, even though it was known that this was a highly contagious disease. So most places of work, most factories remained open, many shops, pubs. The only real debate was around cinemas, it seems. There was a kind of a bit of a moral controversy over cinemas, which is quite a relatively new thing at that time. And some people thought cinemas were a place where immoral behaviour could exist, and it was so there were restrictions on cinemas. There was decisions to only allow two viewings a day. The auditoriums had to be well ventilated in between. Children weren't allowed in for a period, and nor were soldiers. So cinemas attracted some attention, but other things, many of them stayed open. Transport buses, trains, trams, churches, even though outdoor, large outdoor public gatherings, even though the risk of contagion was known to be high. This did not, as the suffering increased and so many people fell desperately ill, this did not inspire public confidence. And so when the local authorities, and of course there wasn't a full NHS system, there was some rudimentary social support available, but it simply didn't cover many people. Many of the hospitals were private hospitals, for example. There was still the workhouse system in operation, and the workhouse infirmaries were simply not capable of dealing with a disease, a pandemic of this magnitude. So a lot of people went without the care they needed, and the services that did exist were overwhelmed. And so the call went out for volunteers to help. And at first, the local reports, the media reports, suggest that the response to that call was very weak. It picked up later on a bit, but certainly initially it was nothing like the enormous response we've seen in recent weeks to the appeals locally for people to volunteer in their local community or to help the NHS. Nothing like that at all. There was enormous difficulty in from a government viewpoint in mobilising a community response to help. I mean, it's been suggested that maybe people had become a bit more callous because of the war. That death and tragedy and loss was a much more widespread occurrence already. But I'm not sure that fully explains it. I think that it's very, very difficult for people to take action at some risk to themselves when they don't feel they're being told a full and honest story. It has to be a general risk, doesn't it? That if you think about something of this magnitude happening at such a scale, it feels that there's people are saying now it feels like there's a kind of war going on, and you do look for enemies, you do look for people responsible, and sometimes the fake news becomes very very effective. There was certainly all sorts of quack cures, people making money out of entirely spurious claims about different sorts of medicines or remedies that would protect people from the plague. Well, that goes back to the 1660s, and it was also true in the First World War. There are times where you do sense a kind of harmony between community-led action and the actions of more formal state institutions, particularly at local level. And one of the things that I picked up was some of the responses to the Great Floods of 1953, where many coastal districts, very extensively along the east coast of England and Scotland, were terribly damaged by floods, and there was massive loss of life and destruction of property. The accounts that you read of particularly the initial responses, how people helped each other, there seems to have been a very high level of combined activity by the local councils, by the coast guards, and all sorts of community organisations. The women's voluntary services, the WRVS as it now is, were prominent. So were groups of scouts and all sorts of local associations came together very fast, within hours, to organise a kind of joint response, to raise funds for relief, but also to give shelter, food, comfort to people who were worst affected, and it happened fast and on a big scale. And I think that the reports you can read about that show that there was great pride in what was achieved in that time, and there was one particular account of a police constable on the east coast of Essex saying, you simply didn't have to ask anyone to help. Nobody waited to be asked, they just got on with it. And I think that was probably a very common picture then. So at that local level, where people knew each other, I think that helps enormously. The quality of the response, the combination of people coming together, whether they were local residents or whether they have some kind of institutional state role, was impressive. I think it's reasonable to say that not only the upheavals, the emergency, the crisis, the catastrophe impacts most heavily on people who are poorest. I think that's nearly always the case. That seems to be a general pattern, but not only in the crisis, but also in the aftermath. These things often have a very long tail. It looks like in coronavirus that will certainly be the case. And the question about, who will pay for this going forward, who will step forward, who will recover quickly, and who won't, which will be the communities that are most left behind in the aftermath of this this pandemic. That's we cannot, of course, know that, but there must be a great concern based on what's happened in the past, that it will be those who are already most excluded and most at the margins of society, and people who are poorest. And without a sustained national awareness of this and a sustained effort to do something about it, that may well happen again. It does seem to me that we're at a time where things hang somewhat in the balance, and it could go in either direction. Perhaps more likely that things will revert more quickly back to what they were like before, and perhaps for some people even worse off. But nevertheless, the possibility that there's some fundamental, some big, lasting, consequential change could happen. One thing that I was very struck by in looking at what's happened in the past was the experience in the 1790s, when Britain was at war with France. There were catastrophic harvests, and the price of wheat increased enormously, and people went hungry as a result. People were starving in many parts of the country, and there were different responses. A very ineffective response by government. I think they put a tax on flour used on people's wigs. I think that was their main reaction. And there were so-called bread riots. I'm not sure they actually were riots, but there were protests in hundreds of communities around the country. There was also a big philanthropic effort, according to people like Edmund Burke. But there was also something else, which was a community response that turned out to be enormously had huge consequences and implications for the future, and very hopeful ones, because it was working people self-organising through friendly societies, in a form of mutual aid. They pooled their funds and created flour clubs so that they could buy grain in bulk and make it more affordable. They then, some of them, started building windmills so they could mill the grain and make it even cheaper for their members and for their local communities. And then in some cases, and this is perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all, they harnessed the latest technology of the time, which was steam power, and they created a whole series of steam-driven windmills that could operate at a much larger scale. In fact, the one in Birmingham was the largest in the country, and it was entirely run and funded by working people. They raised money through a kind of community share issue. They had no legal powers to do it. They'd got on with it anyway. Some of these mills survived for decades, some right through the 19th century. They became the foundation for something they've almost forgotten about now, but they became the foundation for something much bigger. They were a form of early cooperative, and the cooperative movement that flourished later in the 1830s and 40s actually owed a lot to those early pioneers. I've actually got a token here, which is the Union Mill in Birmingham in 1796. And on one side, it's got a cornucopia with wheat and garlands of wheat around the edges. But also on the other side, there's a number, 973. It was a membership token. So we know that there were at least 973 members of the Cooperative Union Mill in Birmingham in 1796. I think that we can't be too glib about learning lessons from the past. We always operate within our own particular contexts. But nevertheless, there are certain things that I think it is fair to say may be more likely to happen. And I think that the possibility that there could be positive social change from this, the possibility that we could be edging towards a society that is more collaborative, more driven by the local rather and relationships, and kindness and solidarity, that can emerge from the local, and less driven by a kind of centralizing remote command and control behavior. Will that happen? We don't know, but I think the value of that is more evident now than it might have been a year ago.